Well, good afternoon, everyone. The clock on my computer says that it is 12 o'clock, our designated starting time. I'm Dr. Rodney Jones, and I'd like to welcome you to this fourth webinar in our Learn at Lunch webinar series. And in just a few brief moments, I'm going to introduce today's speaker and today's topic. First, I want to remind you or let you know, if this is the first of this series that you've attended, that this webinar series is part of a larger farm management and marketing educational effort that we have undertaken here in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Oklahoma State University. We have an online curriculum that we are in the process of developing that involves, I believe it's 28 or 29 different subtopic areas that range all the way from farm and ranch financial management to production management to risk management and marketing issues, and just a number of broad issues related to farm and ranch management and marketing. This set of materials is also being made available as FSA borrower training, where participants would be required to complete about 18 of those modules on a required course track, along with 7 additional modules. And along with that, there would, of course, be some evaluation exercises that would be expected. If you want more information about either the farm management curriculum in general, which is available to everyone for no charge, or the borrower education training materials to meet those requirements, check it out on the website that is posted down there in the chat box area for more information about that. Along with the borrower education training materials, we do have some resources available for one-on-one assistance for participants in that program. Money made available through a grant that I'm going to talk about here in just a second that would support one-on-one assistance for participants through our IFMAPS program. So if you're interested in that, or if you know someone who needs that, please check out the website there listed in the chat box for more information about how to take advantage of that opportunity. That one's going to run out fairly quickly. In early June, we will stop offering that as a free alternative, because we are limited in the number of participants that we can financially support through the grant. This overall entire program started as a partnership between USDA Farm Service Agency and a group of us here at Oklahoma State University, and it's supported and, of course, partially funded by USDA Farm Service Agency Outreach Grant. With that, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Shannon Farrell, for this fourth in our Learn at Lunch webinar series. Is going to talk about a topic that has been near and dear to many of us for a long time, transition tools and having those tough discussions about transitioning the farm or ranch operation to the next generation. So with that, Dr. Farrell, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Jones. I appreciate that. And as I look over here at the participant list, I see lots of longtime friends over there. So good to see you guys joining us today. And for all of our new friends, welcome aboard as well. Before I start talking about this topic, I'm going to talk to you about compression. You know, sometimes you're trying to download a file from the internet and it's compressed or zipped or something like that to make it more manageable. Well, let's talk about today. Now, when I got my estate planning endorsement in law school, that was the result of me taking 18 credit hours that were specifically focused on estate planning, income taxation, estate taxation, and the like. And so we often take the stuff that we talk about in those 18 credit hours and we cram that into a 2-day workshop presentation that sometimes we make. Sometimes we cram that down into a 1-day presentation Sometimes we cram that stuff down into an hour-and-a-half seminar, and Rod and Brent told me I have 20 minutes to talk about it today. So the compression rate today is pretty high. What we're going to do is, I wouldn't even call this a 30,000-foot flyover. This is a satellite image from space of the things that you need to address when you're talking about farm transition planning, either for yourself, your own operation, or for the clients that you serve. But we want to do some issue awareness today, get you an idea of some of the questions that you need to be asking, and that then equips you to go out and look for some of the information like we've got through the resources that Rod just told you about as you start going down that path for your family yourself. So why is this such an important topic? Well, it's because we ask most farmers and ranchers what they would like to have happen with their farm or ranch, and I would argue that probably 99 times out of 100 you'll hear something to the effect of, well, gosh, I want to keep this operation in one piece, and I want to keep my family farming on it. So if that's our goal, how are we doing? And the research says we're doing a pretty bad job of that as an industry. Now, the Family Business Institute did a survey, and they were looking at farms, ranches, and other small family-owned businesses, and they found that on average, 30% of those family-owned businesses were making the transition from the founding generation to the second generation. So less than a third of them were surviving intact. And if you take that from the second generation down to the third, that number falls to 12%, and then down the rest of the way, that third generation to the fourth generation, that falls to 3%. So we're not having a tremendous success rate of keeping these small family businesses together. So why is that? Well, Spafford did a review of literature, and what he found is that it all pretty much came down to three reasons that these small family-owned businesses, and especially farms and ranches, weren't staying together. Number one, that was inadequate estate planning. If we don't have a good estate plan in place, then whatever we own individually after we pass away is going to be distributed according to our state's what I would call default rules. The technical term is intestate succession rules, but those are basically statutes that determine how title to property is transferred after someone dies if they don't have a will, a trust, or some other form of will substitute. And almost invariably, what those state statutes do, no matter what state you're in, is distribute property as evenly as they can amongst your surviving heirs. Now, that might seem pretty fair on the surface, but if the point of us trying to keep our family farming and to keep the farm together is to keep that asset base together, then the intestate succession statutes really don't have a choice but to split that asset base apart. So that's the first problem. Secondly, insufficient capitalization. Sometimes farmers and ranchers really are trying to be visionary and figure out a way for that next generation to come back and be an active member of the farm or ranch. But what they often don't take into account is the fact that if we're going to support not one family, but maybe two or even three families, our farm has to expand in size and scope just to generate the cash flow that we need to support those farm families. And if we don't have a sufficient asset base in place, we're going to start eating into the equity of that operation and pretty soon get that operation below the level of being financially viable. Now, last but most certainly not least is a failure to prepare the next generation properly. You know, here at OSU, we have so many of our students going off for internships this summer, and that internship is serving a twofold process. You know, number one, we can think that those companies are being benevolent and trying to give those young folks some experience while they still have a firm hand on the wheel to guide them. But, you know, also those businesses are engaging in a summer-long interview of those young people. They're trying to make sure that those people have the skill set that they need to successfully work within the framework of that organization. But how often do we see it on our farms and ranches, which, you know, if you look at the most recent ARMS data, have an average net worth of, you know, almost $1 million? Are we turning over those operations to someone when we've never given that person any sort of an opportunity to experience the reins of management themselves? We never really give them any formal training about management and how we make our decisions and why we make our decisions. And so instead, what we do in farms and ranches is say, well, hey, so here's what's going to happen. I'll operate this farm and ranch exclusively until I die, which is a randomized event. You won't have any idea when it's coming. Neither will I. You don't get to have any management say until I'm gone. But when that does happen, then bang, it's all yours. I mean, if you look at that objectively from a business continuity perspective, that's kind of a recipe for disaster. So we've got to overcome all three of these challenges in order to really see our farms successfully make that transition to the next generation. So let's say your producers are on board with that. Okay, you're right. I want to start moving this process ahead. Lots of them will focus on estate planning. And to be sure, estate planning is an absolutely critical piece of the transition planning process, okay? So when we're talking about estate planning, that's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle. We have to start talking about a 5-step process here, and estate planning is just one of those steps. But what we're going to talk about today is kind of a 5-step process for going through this transition plan and really attacking it on all fronts simultaneously so we can really maximize the opportunity that we have for success. So we're going to talk about first steps. Where do we just get started? What do we do to put one foot in front of the other? We're going to talk about communicating with our stakeholders, then developing a plan for how the business is going to maintain its continuity to the next generation. We're going to talk about what happens to our individual ownership of our stake in the business after we pass away, and then how we actually go about implementing that plan. Now, this is a challenge for lots of family farms and ranches, though, because there's some generational sandwiching going on here. And I'll use as an example a farm-owning family from back east, way far back east. But in this operation, Mom's the principal operator. She calls the shots, and she's done a pretty good job by all accounts. She's actually run this farm longer than anyone in her family ever has. But Mom's 90. You know, she's kind of getting up there a little bit. Physically, she's not able to do as much on a daily basis as she used to. And, you know, we don't get to live forever. That's just one of the unfortunate facts. Now, Dad tries to help out, but Dad's had some health problems. He's been in and out of the hospital lately, and he's 95. You know, he's had a nice, long life already, and there's really, you know, some certainty there that we don't have him for a lot longer. Now, they could turn things, oops, sorry about that, folks. We could turn things over back to our next generation, but that next generation's already 68 years old. And see, one of the consequences of us living longer, which is generally regarded by most as a positive thing, is that if we don't turn over any part of the operation until that founding generation's gone, well, that generation's not going to get it until they're, you know, well into their retirement years, and they may not want to take on the additional challenge that they face. They might want to say, you know what, I'd like to retire. I feel like I've earned that, so it's time to turn things over to the next generation, perhaps. Well, in this case, you know, we've got a 34-year-old grandson who's a sharp kid, has by all accounts been doing a good job with the responsibilities that he's been given. But, boy, that's a young age to turn this operation over completely. We sure would like to be able to ease that transition and move him to those management, you know, responsibilities over time. So you see that this example might seem a little bit extreme just because of the specific family we're talking about. But if I got rid of that picture and just told you this is a generic farm family, all those numbers, you know, aren't shocking. We've all seen families that are working in an operation just like that. So who do we need to have given the transition plan then? My argument is absolutely everybody. And what surprises some people is who I argue most vigorously needs to have a transition plan. And especially vulnerable are young families. You know, when we talk about estate planning, who shows up at the meetings? Well, folks that are, shall we say, seasoned operators, okay? Folks usually in their 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, and they view estate planning as a primary thing that they're concerned about, and they view it as a clear and present need for themselves. But folks with young families, if you lose one of those operators, especially if they're trying to support a beginning operation with off-farm income, you lose their labor, their management, and that off-farm income support, your farm is in a world of hurt, okay? So this plan is especially important for young families because they're so vulnerable. You know, by that same token, farms that are on the verge of becoming viable, meaning they're probably about to make the switch from being supported by off-farm income to the operators saying, nope, we're going all in. We're going to, you know, give up our off-farm employment because we believe the farm itself is of a sufficient size now that we need to devote it, our efforts full time. Farms with limited asset liquidity. If something majorly disruptive, happens to the farm, and we lose an operator, or we lose the income they're contributing, or their management, and we need to sell stuff to try to make that up, maybe to deal with mortgages that have been accelerated by the death, or something like that, well, what are we going to sell? You know, for most of our farms and ranches, the vast majority of their long-term assets are land, and land isn't liquid. And lots of times we just don't want to sell land because that's an important part of our production base. So instead of saying farms with limited asset liquidity, I might as well just say farms, because I think that deals with most of our farms actually in the United States. Last but certainly not least, complex families. You know, if we've had remarriages, if there are step siblings involved, if there are step parents involved, There's a lot more in terms of family complexity. There's a lot more in terms of emotional complexity going on. And we really have to have a plan for dealing with how that operation is going to move forward. But on the other hand, if we take the bull by the horns and really do a good job with succession planning, wow, there are potentially really big advantages here. This is a graph of the net worth of an actual farm operation that even had farm financial records going back to 1930, so that's pretty impressive. But you see there are several dips there, and those occurred when someone passed away, and so what we had to do is either sell off part of the asset base to satisfy an heir that didn't want to return back to the farm, or we had to mortgage the existing asset base that we may have already owned free and clear, by the way, to pay off that other heir. And so if you really think about it, if you do a bad job of planning, you can buy the same farm from yourself over and over again, which isn't really a great model for building business value. But on the other hand, if we had a good transition plan and managed to keep that asset base all intact, wow, that can make a tremendous difference in the net worth of our operation. And with respect to this operation, we're talking about a change of nearly $5 million in net worth. So I think that's something that we really need to be shooting for. Okay, Farrell, you've convinced me. Let's start talking about those 5 steps. And again, to go through them real quickly, let's figure out where we're at now, take our first steps, communicate with our stakeholders, develop a business succession plan, develop a plan for estate giving or lifetime gifts for the people that own a stake in the business, and then figure out a way to actually implement that. Step 1, figure out where we're at now. I can't overstate the importance of figuring out a really thorough inventory. And I mean inventory like you've never inventoried before. All personal and real property. And I want to know, how is the title to that asset held? So if it's real property, get the deed. If it's personal property, find the title, serial number, description, whatever the case might be. We want to know the market value of that asset. We want to know the tax basis of that asset. And if we have a book value for that asset, we need that in front of us as well. But we also need to inventory our business relationships, the network that our successor will need to operate in. You know, we don't just get to pick up relationships where some other person left them off. We're going to have to take time to build a connection between our successor and our vendors and our customers as well. We need to inventory our people, who are the human resources of our business. And not on that slide, but something that's incredibly important as well, is we need to inventory our values and our goals. What's important to us as an operation as we move forward? One important piece of this process that I also want to emphasize is figuring out what we need to generate in terms of income for our farm families. If mom and dad are going to draw back from the operation a little bit, how are we going to support them in that form of retirement? And I know farmers don't retire. When our farmers move to emeritus status, that's the term that we'd use here at the university, right? When they kind of come in and do the stuff they want to do, but not the stuff they don't want to do. And if we're going to bring someone else in, what's that going to cost? So we also need to figure out, all right, what exactly are mom and dad withdrawing from the farm in terms of their support? And if we need to double that for another family, that number gets pretty big pretty quick. Another thing we need to ask ourselves then is, okay, do we have the capacity with our existing asset base to support that many people, or do we need to expand? And if we expand, how do we finance that? And do we have a business here? All right, is this something that's greater than the sum of its parts, or is it equal to the sum of its parts? And if it's equal to the sum of its parts, maybe transition planning isn't as important. Maybe we're just trying to add more blocks or more units onto the system that we've got there. Step number 2, we've got to communicate with our stakeholders. We really need to openly and honestly, and I would also add candidly, engage the people that have a stake in our farm and get them as part of this process. And when we talk about stakeholders, we mean people that not just have a financial stake or an ownership stake, but people that have an emotional stake. Other family members that may think the farm is important to them, but they don't really intend to come back and operate it on an active day-to-day basis. When we have that initial family meeting to get some stakeholder buy-in and some input from other people, how do we do that? We need to make sure that we think very carefully about the environment where we hold that meeting. As we get things started, at least as an initial move, we need to have all of our stakeholders involved. You know, not just the active day-to-day participants, but all the emotional stakeholders as well, because we don't want them to feel like they're getting frozen out of this process. If people feel like they don't have an opportunity to let their piece be heard, they start to kind of resist the process, and that'll cause problems for us down the road. So tell them, hey, we're going to talk about the future of the farm and what you think that should look like and what role, if any, you want to play in that future. We're not going to do this on a holiday. The holidays have enough stress of their own, and lots of people like to do this because they say, well, it's convenient, everyone's already there. But folks, this is going to add an emotional overtone to the holiday that you just don't want, and you want this to be important. You want to move this off a holiday and say, look, we're doing this as its own thing because it's got enough gravity and enough merit. We want this to be a separate event where we can really concentrate on talking about the topic. By the same token, we want to do this in a nice, comfortable, neutral place that's not anyone's home. For people to feel like they can really be heard and really be candid, open, honest, they need to be in an emotionally neutral environment. If you have this at someone's house, that person has all the emotional power. And if you have it at your parents' house, if you have it at the family table, right, where you always had all your meals, everyone fits back into their emotional roles, and everyone sees everyone else in those old familiar emotional roles, and it's really hard for people to regard each other as peers, which they really need to do in this process. We're also going to make ourselves free of distractions, so no cell phones, no little kids. Teenagers might actually need to be part of this conversation, but no little kids that need to be looked after, and we're going to find someone else to take care of all the family chores so that no one ducks out. There may be some difficult conversations here, and lots of people kind of want to use an excuse to deal with a distraction like a cow or an irrigation pivot or a kid as a way of exiting the conversation and not having to confront that, but we don't need that to happen in this conversation, okay? And this is not a one-and-done deal. This is to get the conversation started, but your stakeholders are going to want to come back together and meet several times throughout this process to keep that dialogue going, get input, provide information that those individual family members have gathered, and so on. But once we've started that communications process, we have to start developing a plan to help this business move to the next generation. And so that can take on a number of different paths, but we also want to talk about a number of obstacles in those paths. First off, we see this time and time again. We have an heir that wants to come back and be a principal operator on the farm, and we have an off-farm heir that, might care very deeply about the family and the farm, but they're not going to come back and be a part of the day-to-day operations. So we've got this farm kid, city kid problem, and lots of farmers and ranchers want to treat all their kids equally, but that creates perhaps even more problems than treating them unequally would. And that's because if you give a farm ownership interest to an on-farm heir and an off-farm heir, economics tells them to look at that asset very differently. If you're the farm kid, the way that you get the most out of that asset is by growing the business, increasing returns to labor and management and ownership. So that means that when you get excess returns, you want to invest those returns back into the farm operation. If you're the city kid, you look at that ownership interest like an investment, a stock or a bond. So it either needs to generate dividends or you need to sell it so you can go invest in something that will. So if you get excess returns to the farm, you want to distribute that as dividends. You're just creating a natural environment where those things are going to run into each other and cause conflict. Even if your family members get along, economics are just telling them to do different things. So what we first have to understand is that equal is not equitable, by definition almost. If we have an heir that's working on the farm and working on a daily basis to grow it, it's not really fair to them to treat the off-farm heir the same way and giving them an equal ownership interest. And the reverse is true. So heirs might get different amounts and different kinds of assets, and that's okay. They don't have to be the same, because we might think that we're being equitable, but actually we're not. By being equal, we may be unfair. When we're talking to our off-farm heirs, talk about what's your desire to participate. Do you want to participate? We just never really ask you. Are you willing to contribute capital if we need to grow the operation? And we also need to have policies for on-farm employment. If you're going to work on the farm, that may not be a right. That may be something that you need to earn. What do you have to do to earn that? And then what are the benefits going to be from that? And also, if you're going to be an owner, for example, if you're an off-farm heir that owns farm assets, if we need to make a capital call and get additional investment into the farm, are you willing to do that? My personal pet peeve when we're talking about succession planning, and I think some of my fellow team members might feel the same way, is sweat equity, right? The someday kid, this will all be yours estate plan. If you'll just work on this farm for way below market wages, the exchange for that is that when I die, whenever that is, it might be when I'm 101 or it might be tomorrow, you get the farm, perhaps to the exclusion of the off-farm heirs as well. And folks, we don't have enough time in our session today to talk about all the issues here, but most of the time when you see sweat equity plans, it's kind of a punt, okay? It's kind of a way of dodging really engaging in a serious transition planning process. So the way to deal with that is kind of go back to what we talked about on critical issue number 1. Have a family employment plan and say, look, if you work on the farm, here's the way that we're going to credit you for building equity in the farm operation, and make it explicit so all the heirs can see that and understand that that's the way that you earn equity in the farm, or alternatively, you can contribute capital as well. Again, having family employment plans and policies in place are critical to that. Having a plan for building equity in the business is critical to that. So there are all sorts of issues there that you really need to contend with. If you don't have an heir that intends to come back to the farm, okay, you need to ask yourself, I've accumulated this asset base. What's the way for me to recognize that value? I need to find a way that this asset base can support me, as I want to retire or perhaps reduce my level of active involvement. Do I need to sell this asset base? That's something that we actually can think about. I know lots of farmers don't like to think about that, but in lots of other industries, you build the value of an asset, and then the way that you realize that value is you sell it, okay? Now, there are lots of approaches that business owners in this position can take. They could, like we said, liquidate the assets, just recognize the value and put that into another investment that will provide a return for us in retirement. We could maintain ownership, just hire an operator. And basically, if we don't want to engage in all the physical tasks necessary to run the farming or ranching operation, we basically hire someone to operate it on our behalf and with our oversight. But us providing that management oversight also takes a lot of time as well. And what we might do is seek an outside successor then, which is kind of a hybrid of these two approaches. We're going to find someone to help us operate these assets over time, but eventually what we're going to do is perhaps through some form of favorable arrangement, we're going to transfer ownership of the asset base over time as well. Now, as we're picking out that person, again, we talked about the internships at the very first of the webinar. You need to find an opportunity, maybe in the form of a share lease arrangement, maybe in the form of a joint venture, but spend some time really in depth in an examination of this person's skills and values to figure out if you want to operate together long term. Always make sure you formalize that relationship in the form of a business entity or an operating agreement, but something that makes very clear is the rights and responsibilities of those parties. And again, just because you have someone that may not be coming back to the farm doesn't mean they don't care about what's going to happen on that farm. So don't forget to engage all those stakeholders in that process. As we're going through this, one thing I want to point out is that using business entities like LLCs or corporations, or to a lesser extent, even trusts, we can separate out a lot of elements of a farm to accomplish some of the goals that we've just talked about. For example, we could put ownership of land or operating assets or the business itself into a separate entity. We could give controlling interests of that entity to the on-farm heirs so they call the shots on operations of the farm. But we can also give the right to participate in the revenues of that farm to an off-farm heir, so they're not left completely without any form of inheritance there, but they also have a role that may fit the level of involvement they want to have with the farm operation. Or let's say that you don't have any heirs that are going to come back to the farm. Again, we could put ownership of those farm assets into an entity. We can give operational control of that to a successor that may be unrelated to us, but we can still retain for ourselves the right to participate in the revenues from the farm so that we have a retirement income for our founding generation there. All right, let's talk about estate planning very quickly, and we could talk about this for days. I just kind of want to go over a list of estate planning tools I think everyone needs to have in their toolbox. Very quickly, if you've got kids under the age of 18, man, is it crucial that you have a designation of who should have guardianship of those kids if something should happen to you. We just can't overstate the importance of that. There's no excuse for not doing it. If you got kids under the age of 18, get that done. Get it done immediately. If you have any sort of retirement accounts or any sorts of investments, lots of times those accounts will carry beneficiary designations, which gives you the opportunity to say, if I die, let me rephrase that. That's an actuarial eventuality, as my friend says. When you die, who should receive that investment account? And so it's very cheap, very effective, very quick working estate planning tool. So make sure all of your beneficiary designations have been reviewed and that those assets are going to the people or the entities that you want them to go to. Powers of attorney for business and healthcare, and this isn't necessarily an estate issue, but it is a way of saying we need to make sure that if we're incapacitated, that we have durable powers of attorney for business, which means someone else has authority to pay for our bills, engage in transactions if we need to, and to make sure they can carry out our business affairs. Healthcare power of attorney, by the same token, indicates someone who has the power to make medical decisions for us. So if we're incapacitated and can't choose which medical procedure that we need, the healthcare power of attorney can help make that decision on our behalf. That's distinct from an advance directive for healthcare. That deals with end-of-life care decisions. Do we want CPR? Do we want respiratory support, hydration, nutrition, pain management? Those are all things that we need to deal with in advance directive for healthcare, and those are very important decisions that we need to talk about with our family. Of course, everyone needs to have a will, and a will is simply a set of instructions for distributing your property when you die. Now, wills are often coupled with a trust, and I want to dispel one quick myth about that, by the way. Even if you've got a very thorough trust and you've put everything that you can think of into that trust, you still need a will. If for no other reason to say, if I didn't put anything into that will, or sorry, let me rephrase that. If I didn't put anything to the trust and it's still hanging out there, the will can put that property into the trust so the trust can do its job of transferring the property. Now, does everyone need a trust? Not necessarily. But the larger your asset base, the more complex your tax situation, or the more restrictions that you want to place on the use of the property, then a trust seems to be more of the way to go. But remember, again, a will and a trust need to work together. You don't get to have one oftentimes without the other. Last and certainly not least, life insurance. Especially for young families, term life can actually be a pretty inexpensive tool that could provide a lot of benefit. Again, let's go back to that first scenario we talked about. If we have a young family that's pretty heavily leveraged and we lose a mom or a dad, and we not only lose them and the labor they're contributing to the operation, but we're losing the income that they were bringing to help service debt, term life can be a pretty inexpensive way to provide coverage to say we can pay off whatever debt we have and not leave the rest of the family in a financial dire strait there. All right, that brings us to step 5, which is deploying our plans, evaluating, and revising. And again, we talk about this as a farm transition planning process, emphasis on process. We don't get to be one and done with this. We have to keep working at this throughout our entire lives, basically. So how do we carry that out? Number 1, let's get a strong team of professionals and make them work together to help us in this process. We have to prepare our stakeholders. You know, what were to happen to the farm if we lose a principal operator today? How would this operation continue? We actually need to have a plan in place for that to ensure the continuity of the operation. And like we just talked about, we need to evaluate how this plan's working. If it's not working, let's fix it. If it is working, let's see if we need to tweak it. And anytime something major happens, like we gain someone in the family or lose someone in the family, if we have a major acquisition or a major disposition of property, those are all opportunities for us to go back and really look at the plan and make sure it's still doing what we need it to do. As you're going through this process, make sure you have a good attorney that's well-versed in business planning and estate planning and that understands agriculture. All those things are important. So sometimes we just want to go to the family lawyer down in the courthouse square because we've had them do everything for us always. This is specialized work, so we need a specialist. Same thing for our accountant and tax professional, people that understand agricultural taxation and estate and transition planning in agriculture. A farm business consultant might be very valuable for us, especially as we're evaluating some of our what-ifs. You know, as this business operation evolves, what are the paths that could take? What are some of the business pros and cons of the mechanisms that our lawyer and our accountant are telling us to pursue here? These people need to work together because the lawyer will want to avoid risk. The accountant will want to minimize tax. And what we need to remember is that we're not trying to follow only one of those objectives. We're trying to maximize and optimize with respect to all of those things to make our business look the way that we want it to look as we go down the road. Let's not overlook the importance of having a family communications consultant or perhaps a mediator help us as well, because sometimes these conversations can be a little bit energetic, shall we say, a little animated, and it might be useful for us to have a neutral party to help guide us through that conversation and help us resolve conflicts if they arise. We talked about the importance of preparing your stakeholders if something happens very quickly, something unforeseen occurs. I call it the hit by a blank plan, whether that's truck, bus, asteroid, lightning, whatever. What happens if we lose a principal operator? Let's lay out a set of procedures very clearly, and I mean very step by step, as to what we need to do to keep this farm operation going tomorrow. And I mean very literally, folks. Don't underestimate what I'm saying here. If someone dropped in from Mars and landed on your farm, could they look up this plan and operate your farm tomorrow? That's what I'm talking about. And we often assume that because someone's been by our side for years, they assume we know why we're doing everything that we're doing, or that we know what we need to do tomorrow, and we don't get to make that assumption. So be very thorough about that. Keep good farm records, especially of inventory, so that people know where are the cows, where are the horses, where are the chickens, the pigs, the dairy cattle, where are the fields. Know where everything is. Here's where the truck and the fuel and the inputs and the feed and everything that they need to take care of those farm assets are. Make sure you give them the right documents that they need, the powers of attorney that might be important, keys and passwords, not just the physical keys, but the electronic keys to get everything that they need to. Make sure they know who they can contact, who are their customers, who are the vendors, who are their mentors, who they can ask for help. What records do they need to keep while this transition process is going on? And if there's a death involved or a disability, what can they do by themselves? What can they do after they talk to a consultant or a mentor? And what do they need a court's approval to do before they proceed with it? We're going to talk about plans, and plans can be fantastic, but remember, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. This plan is going to have to adapt, and the day that we implement it, we're going to see, oh yeah, there was this contingency that we didn't think about. But that's okay. It's a plan in place because it's something to adapt from versus having nothing at all. And so what I advise folks is that, look, I know this is an intimidating process. It's going to take time, it's going to take money, and it's going to take us contemplating our own mortality, which no one likes to do. I totally understand that. But instead of focusing on that, I want our producers to focus on the peace of mind that they're going to have when they've gone through this process and they say, okay, you know what? If stuff happens, we're prepared. We have a way to deal with this, and even if major issues occur, we still have a way to make this operation go forward to the next generation. And how much better do we feel about that? That's the real reward that we have for making this transition process really work. Now, we've talked about a lot today. Okay, we gave you an absolute drink of water from a fire hose. So if you want more resources on this, we've tried to compile a farm transitions online library, and we're constantly adding to that, constantly curating that. That's at our website, agecon.okstate.edu/farm transitions. All of our resources are there, including our farm transitions workbook, which is a pretty lengthy workbook that walks you through these 5 steps, step by step, so you can work through it at your own pace with your own family. And of course, we need to know how we did today. So the powers that be said, make sure, Farrell, that you put the survey link into your PowerPoint. So there you go. But also, if you look over in your chat box, the survey link's right there. The way that we get the money to keep doing programs like this is to make grant agencies happy. And grant agencies need to know that we're having an impact and that you're learning what we said we'd teach you through these processes. So please take some time to fill out that survey and let us know how we did, and let us know how we can be of service to you in the future. If you have questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, we want to hear them, because your questions and comments make our transition programs better, and that's what we're constantly striving to do. That's my email address, shannon.l, that's a lowercase l, by the way, .farrell@okstate.edu. With that, questions. What can we do to help you guys with our Q&A today?
Thank you, Shannon. And as Shannon mentioned, please type questions into the chat box, and we'll take just a few minutes here to make sure that we capture those questions and can adequately address those questions. Again, before you leave, be sure and fill out the survey at the link that is posted there in the chat box. One more thing. I would like to remind you of our next webinar, which will be April 11th. Dr. Damona Doy will be talking about leasing and rental arrangements in the current farm economic environment. Our webinars, as always, are archived and can be accessed from that eFarm Management website that is also listed there in the chat box. And with that, I can't think of any other announcements, but we would like to hear a question or two from you before we sign off here. So thank you very much for participating. Here we have a question. Is there a source of lawyers, consultants, and all the other groups that focus on agriculture? So Shannon, I'll let you address that.
Man, I wish there was. Because that sure would make things a lot easier. And unfortunately right now we really don't have a directory or even really an association of professionals that kind of focus on that area. So I'd tell you to do a few things. Number one, I want you to interview the professionals that you're hiring in this process. And I mean that quite literally. I want you to come up with a list of questions to really thoroughly probe them on their experience, their knowledge, and their background when it comes to these ag-specific issues. Ask that person for reference clients. Like, all right, can you point me to someone you've done work for that I could talk to? And then once you talk to those reference clients, talk to indirect references. Say, hey, do you know of anyone else that this attorney or accountant or consultant has done work for that I could talk to? Those indirect references, that's where you get the really juicy stuff. So check that out. Always check someone's accreditation. Make sure their license is in good standing. Check to see if they're a member of any professional organizations that focus on that. When we're talking about estate planning, for example, there's the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel. And that is a pretty difficult to get into group that really thoroughly vets their members. And they have to have certain years of experience, a lot of training to really focus on estate planning issues. And some of the analogs for that are also available in the accounting, the financial professional world, things like that. So a really good interview process. And I know, again, that takes time, but for the level of engagement we're going to have with these people and the importance of the work we're doing, we've got to be thorough in that search. So really put them through the ringer and do a good job of interviewing that professional.
Any other questions for Shannon or any of the rest of us here on the webinar today?
I feel like I need to ask who's doing the typing for Noble. Is that Mariah or John or who? You'll have to sign off on your next question. Ah, here we go. So do you have any advice on getting the entire family together when one or more family members don't want to talk about it? You know, that's a great question, and we actually have a completely separate session on how do you engage stakeholders when they don't want to engage. And sometimes that comes from two directions. You might have a family member, like an heir, that doesn't want to engage in the process, but what I encounter a lot when I'm talking to folks is that mom and dad don't want to engage in the process, and they're kind of a critical piece in this. So we can talk about that. Without going into all the details of a completely separate seminar that we could have on that point, what I would say is we need to make sure that everyone feels like they have the opportunity to engage. So always make sure that folks say, hey, we want to have a talk about this. We want everyone to be involved because we honestly want to know how you view the future of the farm and how you view your role in it. If you don't want to participate, that okay, but this is important to us. We're going to move forward with that process, but we want you to feel like you have a place at the table. So again, even if they choose not to participate, you know, that's okay. Them feeling like they've had the opportunity to participate may be very important. And if they want to freeze themselves out so that they can complain later on to say, okay, well, you know, I felt like this process was unfair and you guys were just going to do what you wanted to do anyway, you have some legitimacy in saying, hey, we tried to give you guys a chance to engage with that, and that was a choice that you made. Kevin had a question. Is it true that a trust is not necessary when assets are less than $6 million? And I would say that that's false. There are lots of opportunities when a trust might be really beneficial, even if you've got less than $6 million worth of assets. And let's talk about the $6 million figure real quick. So, and JC, you're on the line. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're right on this one. For 2017, the unified credit, which is basically, for lack of a better word, the estate tax exemption, is $5.49 million per person. So another way of saying that is that an individual can pass $5.49 million worth of property, estate, and gift tax free if they do it right. Married couples can combine and make that number almost $11 million, 10.98. And lots of people say, okay, well, if I'm above that number, I need to have a trust because that's how I can take advantage of some of the estate tax management strategies. And that's very true. If you're bumping up against that number between both of the heirs, you absolutely need to engage an estate planning professional and a tax professional to help you structure your estate to make sure you don't pay any more estate taxes than you have to. That being said, there are lots of advantages to a trust for estates that are well below that threshold. And the reason that lots of folks, for example, choose to use a trust as their primary estate planning vehicle is because it enables you to pass assets without having to go through probate. Probate is a process that takes time. It's probably going to take a year, at least, in most cases. It's a public process, which means your inventory, your accounting, and your holdings basically become public record. There's lots of opportunities for people that don't like how your estate was handled to try to contest the probate. And so there's just lots of complications in probate that you can avoid through a trust. Now, a trust doesn't, come cheaply. What we're doing basically with the trust is we're kind of front-loading a lot of those expenses versus back-loading them. But a trust can distribute property very quickly. It's a much more private process, and it can basically facilitate a much smoother transfer of assets than a probate can. So I wouldn't put a dollar value on if it's bigger than this, it has to be a trust. If it's lower than this, it's got to be a will. You got to consider what you're trying to do with the assets, how quickly you want them to transfer, what restrictions, if any, you want to have on those assets. Those are the things I start thinking about when I think about will versus trust. Rodney had a good point about making someone think the transition conversation is their idea, especially when you're talking about mom or dad. And mom and dad don't like thinking about the farm going on without them. They don't want to think about their own mortality. They sure would like for things, oftentimes, to be the way that they had them when they were operating them. I think a way to deal with that is if mom and dad don't want to talk about the transition process, you need to tap into their desire for the continuity of the farm, though. If you ask them, they're going to say, well, yeah, it's hugely important for me to make sure that the farm stays together in one piece and that you kids can keep farming it if you want to. Okay, mom and dad, I'm so grateful for that, and I'm so grateful for the incredibly hard work that you've put into building this operation. Let's figure out a way to make sure we maximize the chances of you achieving that vision of success that you have. Let's do everything we can to make sure that this farm and ranch stays in one piece and that this operation keeps going. We think a way for us to do that is to make sure we cover our bases. What if something were to happen to you guys? Let's talk about how we can make sure that we'd be able to manage it as well as you do. That never hurts to kind of butter their bread a little bit there. But, tap into not their fear, but rather their opportunity, okay? If the fear is not working as a motivator, tap into their desire for the opportunity that operation stays together and prospers the way that they wanted it to. Anybody else have any questions?
Great questions and great participation. If anybody has anything else, let us know here. I guess we'll kind of set a time limit if we don't see any other questions pop up in, let's just say, the next couple of minutes. We'll go ahead and sign off. But if we see questions pop up, we'll stick around and try to address those.